It is a real pleasure to be here. In lots of ways, we have battled our way through floods, road closures, accidents, and a taxi demonstration, which I'm sure my critics laid on deliberately to try and keep me from arriving here. But it is a pleasure to be with you to deliver this keynote address. I am very aware that sometimes in the past, this event has been something of a baptism of fire for an incoming Secretary of State. And as Tony said in his introduction, I've only been in this post for just over 4 months. But I have spoken at the RTS a number of times in the past. And many of you I have got to know in the 10 years that I chaired the Select Committee, and some may even have had the dubious pleasure of having appeared before me. But in fact, my first appearance at Cambridge was 12 years ago when I was the Shadow Secretary of State. And in his report about that convention, Torrin Douglas wrote, "Leading broadcasting executives are descending on Cambridge for the Royal Television Society convention. Among the items on the agenda will be whether the BBC has become too powerful and should be more tightly regulated. There are plenty of important issues to argue about, such as what services the BBC should provide, how big it should be, the level of the licence fee, and whether it should continue to be regulated by its Board of Governors or come under the new communications regulator, Ofcom." And he went on to say, meanwhile, the Conservatives' culture spokesman, John Whittingdale, has set up his own panel to review the future funding of the BBC. I suspect at the RTS convention in a decade's time, we will be having the same debate once again, although I doubt that I shall still be part of it. But it is right that that debate should take place, because television is of huge importance to the nation, and the BBC lies at the heart of British television. I've always loved TV, as Tony said. And it's often said that politicians don't have the time or the desire to watch TV, or that if they do, then the only things they watch will be Newsnight, House of Cards, Borgen, and the thick of it. I watch all of those. But I grew up loving programs like Batman, Doctor Who, and Thunderbirds, and admit that I still watch all of those in their modern incarnations today. And my PVR is full of shows to catch up on like Strike Back, Humans, Partners in Crime, Gotham, and X Factor. So television matters to me, and I'm acutely conscious that it is something that this country is extraordinarily good at. The success of our tax credits is now attracting films like Mission Impossible 5 and Star Wars, and high-end TV shows like Game of Thrones, the latest series of 24, and the medieval drama The Bastard Executioner, which is to be made in the UK. The worldwide popularity of such dramas also helps to attract millions of visitors to these shores. Great creativity and content will always find a demand, but I'm also very conscious that the industry is going through a time of extraordinary change. For the viewer, there is a proliferation of choice on a scale not witnessed before. Not only can television programs now be viewed whenever one chooses to watch them, and on a range of different devices, the choice available goes on growing as the traditional public service broadcasters continue to invest in high-quality programs, while more recent entrants like Sky and now Amazon and Netflix are also commissioning more and more original content. The creative industries employed around 1.8 million people last year, including those in the TV, film, video, and radio sectors, and those in IT services, including video games. And the TV industry estimates that it alone generated £13.3 billion in revenue in 2014, an increase of 3.1% year on year. And it is against that backdrop that we approach Charter Review. And given the huge change that has taken place in the last 10 years, it is surely sensible that we should take this opportunity to consider the BBC's role in this changing environment, to look at its funding, its governance, its mission and purpose, its scale and scope. That is why the Select Committee at the end of the last Parliament spent over a year examining the future of the BBC and produced a report running to some 166 pages. That report was widely welcomed as setting the agenda for the debate on Charter Review. The questions it posed were very similar to those posed in the Green Paper, questions that Steve Hewlett recently described as, quote, entirely predictable and perfectly proper questions about the BBC's purposes, scope and funding. I was therefore somewhat surprised that the Green Paper was greeted as somehow heralding the demise of the BBC, or as evidence of a Murdoch-inspired agenda to dismantle it, a charge that I found particularly surprising since my last meeting with Rupert Murdoch took place over 4 years ago after I'd served a warrant on him requiring his appearance in Parliament in relation to the phone hacking inquiry. So there is absolutely no prospect of the BBC being abolished. So I found it rather odd that the BBC then asked people if they could live without it. Indeed, my surprise was that 9 of the 70 households said they would prefer to pay nothing and not receive the BBC. Had I been asked if I could live without the BBC, the answer would certainly have been no. I cannot imagine anyone but the BBC commissioning the distinctive and brilliant QI, which has now been sold around the world. And it is hard to believe that a commercial broadcaster would have stuck with Blackadder and The Office, neither of which were overnight successes, but which now belong in the Comedy Hall of Fame. Of course, I understand that some saw the publication of the Green Paper so soon after the budget as all part of a wider plot. And I realise that the difficult decision that we had to ask the BBC to meet the cost of free TV licences for those aged 75 will mean hard choices have to be taken. I regret that it was necessary. But it is not unreasonable that the BBC, which receives £3.7 billion from licence fee, should, like every other publicly funded body, be asked to make a contribution towards our overriding objective of getting the country's finances back into balance. In doing so, we reached an agreement which the Director General called the right deal for the BBC in difficult economic circumstances. And I have to say that in the coming weeks, I will be asking the institutions which my department funds directly to make their contributions too. But Charter Review is an entirely separate exercise, and it raises more fundamental questions. Let me be clear. There is no threat to the BBC's status as a world-class broadcaster, let alone an existential threat. What we are exploring, as every Charter Review must explore, is how the BBC fits into the contemporary broadcasting landscape and how it might become even better. It is not my job to run the BBC. I can't dictate what channels exist, which individual programmes are shown, nor how many people are employed, and it would be completely wrong for me or any politician to do so. But it is right to ask questions, such as whether the BBC is sufficiently focused on providing distinctive programmes and services. To give one example, its highest spending service, BBC One, regularly scores lowest on the BBC's metric for fresh and new content, and has been identified in consecutive BBC Trust reports as needing to make its offering more distinct. That's not a value judgment on my part, it's something the BBC Trust has reflected. It is also important to look at the impact that the BBC has on its commercial rivals, and again, to give just one example, whether it is sensible for its main evening news bulletin to go out at the same time as ITV's. So I can confirm that my department is commissioning independent research into some of the BBC's impacts on the market and on its commercial competitors. And this report will feed into the evidence base for Charter Review. No one could deny that the BBC has made some bad mistakes in the last few years. Savile, McAlpine, Ross Brand, severance payments, excessive salaries have all contributed to a widespread view that the governance and management structure needs reform. So as part of the Charter Review process, I'm pleased to announce that I'm setting up an independent review into the governance and regulation of the BBC. It will be conducted by Sir David Clementi, whose experience, including being Deputy Governor of the Bank of England and reviewing the regulation of legal services in England and Wales, makes him uniquely placed to undertake this review. Our review will also take into account responses to the Green Paper and will report early next year. And as I've said from the beginning, I want the public to engage in the debate. So I'm delighted that we have had 28,000 responses already, and that the BBC Trust has received around 40,000 to their own online consultation. Because the licence fee is a major intervention in the broadcasting market, Charter Review will quite properly consider BBC funding too. Public support for the licence fee is not unqualified. The BBC's own annual report shows that it no longer enjoys majority support among the public. And of course, the BBC benefits from subscription and advertising in foreign markets. Interestingly, Armando Iannucci, who gave this year's MacTaggart lecture at Edinburgh, has advocated an overseas subscription model for the BBC, which in time could replace the licence fee. And I'm looking forward to discussing his ideas further with him soon. But it is also very important that objective research about public preferences and willingness to pay forms part of Charter Review. The Green Paper outlines 3 overarching options for future funding models: a modernised licence fee, an alternative household levy, and elements of subscription, and all will deserve careful consideration. I hope that we can now have a serious debate about the future of the BBC, and I'm looking forward to their own contribution to that debate. I very much welcome a number of the proposals in the document published last week. It is undoubtedly good news that the BBC plans to invest more in original British drama and comedy, and I strongly welcome the greater emphasis on the need for more distinctive programming. I'm delighted that the BBC plans to invest in local news, covering important components of local democracy, such as councils, courts, and public services. By commissioning such content from local media outlets and by making it freely available to all, the BBC can support local newspapers and enhance local accountability and democracy. It is an excellent idea, not least because it was proposed by the Select Committee last year. But it is important that it should help local media rather than further undermine them. And I would therefore hope that the BBC will not seek to recruit or employ journalists directly. Instead, they should look to commission content from qualifying local media organisations and news agencies, perhaps on the basis of a tender. The development of an open platform to host the best content from museums, galleries, and other cultural and scientific institutions also appears to be very much in line with the public service ethos and could provide support to them at a time when they too are under financial pressure. And at a time of greater global instability and a rising volume of propaganda from countries with little regard for objectivity and truth, the role of the BBC World Service is even more important. Having spent 5 years as chairman of Parliament's Ukraine group, I am very much aware of the need for an impartial and honest source of news, in contrast to that which comes from Russia. I therefore welcome the BBC's proposals to invest in better news services in those parts of the world where there is the greatest need for an accurate, reliable and impartial source of news. And of course I look forward to the proposals being announced by Tony tomorrow around BBC Worldwide and BBC Studios. These are central to the way the BBC operates as part of a wider media environment and will form an important part of Charter Review discussions in the coming months. Consideration of the wider media environment and the BBC's impact on it matters. And one important aspect of the wider environment is the independent television production sector, which has seen such a strong UK success story over the last decade. During that time, revenue has grown to £3 billion a year, and the export market for finished programmes, international commissions and format sales has trebled in size to £1.2 billion. The regulatory framework put in place to support independent producers has played a part in fostering a vibrant and creative sector. The terms of trade, for example, have helped small independent producers to grow by maximising value from intellectual property rights. It is perhaps worth reminding ourselves what the original objectives of the regulations were back in 2003. To promote cultural diversity and to open up the production system to new energies and voices, to stimulate the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises, promoting creativity and fostering new talent, and to tackle vertical integration within the UK programme supply market. I think those objectives still hold good, but it is also sensible to consider whether the regulations we currently have in place are still the most appropriate for UK businesses and the viewing public. There is no doubt that the supply market has changed fundamentally since 2003. Mergers and acquisitions have changed the landscape. For example, 7 of the 12 biggest UK independent production companies are now integrated with major international broadcasting companies. And in its recent Public Service Broadcasting Review, Ofcom noted that concerns have been expressed about the changing landscape as a result of consolidation and overseas acquisitions. And they went on to suggest that this was an area that should be kept under review. As a result, the time seems right to check whether the regulations remain the most effective means of supporting small independent producers in their negotiations with broadcasters, in light of significant and probably continuing changes in the relative size and strength of the different parties. That is why I've asked Ofcom to undertake a health check of the terms of trade regulations. I remain entirely open-minded about whether any change is needed, and I encourage all interested parties to feed into Ofcom's review so that when we come to decide on whether there should be any change, we will be drawing on the firmest and most comprehensive possible evidence about the likely market impact of any changes. Another hotly debated set of questions exists around media regulations, including the balance of payments, which my department has consulted upon recently. This is an issue which covers copyright remuneration for the retransmission of channels on cable platforms, and more widely, whether the payments between PSBs and platforms are in balance. The consultation sought views on whether and how we could allow more freedom in the negotiations between stakeholders to ensure that the best possible content is made available to the consumer. And in the main, respondents thought that the established system has been working well, although many respondents argued that the policy rationale behind exempting cable platforms from having to pay copyright fees for their content is no longer relevant. Associated with this is the issue of PSB prominence on electronic programme guides, where the debate centres around whether an update to the existing regulations is necessary because of converging technology. These are complex issues and we have more work to do. I shall disappoint you by saying I'm not going to announce the conclusions this evening, but I can confirm that we will be publishing the government's response before the end of the year. The UK also has a leading role to play in the European broadcasting market. It is in all our interests that it remains vibrant and competitive. We have enjoyed a stable regulatory framework that has allowed the audiovisual sector to become such a success story for Europe and the UK. Maintaining the country of origin principle is the cornerstone that has allowed the market to flourish. But the framework must also keep up with technological and market developments. The government supports the overall ambition of the digital single market. It offers huge potential for increasing jobs and economic growth, as well as safeguarding Europe's future competitiveness. It provides an opportunity to make EU rules work better in an increasingly digital world, which is important for the success of the audiovisual sector and creative industry as a whole. We want to ensure our industry is able to reap the benefits that the digital single market brings. Portability is a key part of the Commission's proposals for copyright reform, and the government strongly supports the calls for much greater progress. Consumers understandably want to enjoy continued access to their favourite programmes when they travel abroad, and it is only right for someone who has paid for access to a subscription service, or even just the licence fee, to be able to access that content when on holiday overseas. But we also need to ensure that we do not harm investment in UK content production and export growth, at which the UK excels. We must be careful not to create loopholes that could be exploited. My colleagues in the business department and I are therefore looking to the industry to deliver portability so that we can avoid the threat of overly zealous regulation from Brussels. So I urge broadcasters to make their content more widely available and to come forward with their own proposals for portability and how this can best be made to work for your industry. The issue of cross-border access for those based abroad is harder, and I'm very conscious that it is a particular concern for the audiovisual sector. We are pressing for more detail about the Commission's proposals, which will need to be evidence-based and to respect the rights of businesses to tailor products to their markets. I am also determined that we do everything we can to make sure that strong incentives for investment are not undermined. Striking the right balance is key. We need to make sure that investment remains attractive and creators are fairly paid. However, the current difficulty that those living abroad have in accessing UK channels and content is also a driver for piracy. I was recently alarmed when talking to an expat Briton living in Spain to hear how he was able to access every UK TV channel, including all the free-to-air channels and all the subscription channels, as well as hundreds of movies and catch-up TV for around €25 a month. A quick search on the internet reveals that there are actually a number of services making similar offers. These services are taking money away from the people who invest in content, such as many of you in this room. And it is thanks to effective enforcement partnerships between industry, government and law enforcement agencies that these services are not operating in the UK. We must continue to take action against copyright infringement, both at home and abroad. But we also need to make sure that people like that expat who love our TV and want to pay to watch it have the opportunity to do so legally. This means making sure that changes to copyright law must be supported by a strong enforcement regime. I am pleased that the Commission is going to look at enforcement as part of its proposals, and particularly at commercial scale infringement. The UK is a world leader on copyright enforcement, and the government has taken a number of steps to strengthen its position, including funding for the Police Intellectual Property Crime Unit and helping rights holders to have copyright infringing websites blocked by court order. And we should build on our own experience of what works to help in copyright enforcement across Europe and around the world. And of course, the more that industry can do to innovate and find new and easier ways for consumers to access content legally, the less attractive piracy will become. Finally, I just want to say something very simple. The UK television industry is celebrated and loved across the world. It provides a huge number of jobs and it generates massive economic activity. It informs and entertains. The years ahead promise to be tremendously exciting for your industry, and I see it as a huge privilege to be the government's television champion at this time. Thank you.
John, because of the lateness of your arrival and the fact we have to get to King's College for dinner, we've only got about 8 minutes. So perhaps also going in the spirit of, Jeremy Corbyn question time and all that, I won't ask you any questions. I'll put it over straight away to the floor. But we don't have long, but if you'd like to ask a question, say who you are, raise your hand. We've got mics and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Gentleman there, and then David Abraham, I think, just straight behind. Please say who you are.
Hello, I'm Toby SYFRET from Enders Analysis. First of all, the Green Paper is a very interesting piece, and I think there's a lot to be said for all the 19 questions that are in it. But there's possibly a 20th question, which is never far from the surface, particularly when you talk about universality, when you talk about the subscription possibility of subscription funding, even in Edinburgh too. There's absolutely no mention of in any part of the paper about the future of the DTT spectrum. And there's so many implications from future policy about that, even though it's an international thing. So my question is, could you give us some of your thoughts about the long-term future of it?
You're right, it's not in there. I mean, the Green Paper is obviously specifically about the role of the BBC. The future of the DTT spectrum will affect every broadcaster, every channel, if we reach the point where we come to consider whether or not we need to make changes to spectrum allocation. As you know, there are competing demands for limited spectrum, and the mobile operators are becoming increasingly greedy, and they are, as a result, able to offer more and more services, which are revolutionizing consumption of TV content and many, many other things. And I have no doubt that that competition for spectrum will increase. The argument about whether or not one could release the spectrum currently used for DTT for the mobile operators, for instance, I think we are not nearly at that point yet. If we reach the day when IPTV is pretty much universal, then the argument that you no longer need digital terrestrial transmission is much stronger. But we are quite a long way off. One of the challenges my department has is rolling out superfast broadband. We're making very good progress, but we haven't got there to universal coverage yet. So I don't think we are at the point where we start to debate whether or not it would be a good idea to transfer the spectrum from DTT to other uses. But that may come as technology advances.
Thank you very much.
Secretary of State David Abraham, Channel 4. I think I speak on behalf of everyone here to say that it's great to have a Secretary of State that both loves what we do and also is clearly so knowledgeable about the complex issues that we are all facing. I have two questions. One, picking up on your comments on the terms of trade imbalance and payments investigations that you are now intent on pursuing. What's the timing on that? What's the beginning, middle, and end? Because I think it's a big issue for all of us. And secondly, more broad question, your government has announced an apprenticeship levy for all employers in the UK. And we are at the early stages of trying to understand what that means for the creative industries and how we can ensure that the excellent work that we all do together through creative skill set to design and think strategically about training for our industry, that work can be built on upon the ideas that the government is developing on the apprenticeship levy.
The first question, I mean, I've only just written to Sharon at Ofcom to say, would she follow up the PSB review by doing more work on the terms of trade and giving us a view as to whether or not there is a case for making any changes. I haven't put a timescale on that. I imagine it will probably take a few months. I'll be talking to her about it in due course, but I don't. It's not long into the future, but I don't want to say specifically to give a deadline for it. Your second question, which was your second question was.
The apprenticeship.
Oh, the apprenticeships. Yeah, no, I understand that. Now, I mean, obviously the apprenticeship scheme is being developed by my colleagues in BIS, not us. But no, we are committed to creating a lot more apprentices. I think there is a need in the TV industry amongst, as in so many others, for apprentices. The one thing I am aware of, not least because Diana Kane lobbied me about it, is the view that if large firms in the creative industries are paying a levy towards the creation of apprentices, that should come back to benefit the creative industries. That is something, that is a point which I will certainly make to my colleagues in BIS, but they are still in the process of developing the detail for it. But I am aware of that view, and I have quite a lot of sympathy with it.
Thank
you. John, welcome. It's John McVeigh from PACT. A bit surprised at your announcement about another review of the terms of trade. This will be the 5th review the terms of trade have had in 10 years, and only a matter of weeks since Ofcom did their own full review of the terms of trade. Now, clearly, my concern is that every review has a chilling effect on growth and investment in the companies I represent. So I welcome your comments that this will be a quick review, but I'd also like to seek some assurances that you had a very open mind on this, because it will be yet another case of a lot of non-evidence being provided about what the problems are. Ofcom did not find any major problem with the purposes of the intervention. They still support small British businesses building their companies and being successful internationally. So Clearly, I'm a bit shocked at your announcement tonight, given we're only a few weeks since Ofcom said there's pretty much a clean bill of health.
That's not quite how I read the Ofcom report. What Ofcom did say is that there are concerns being expressed about the changes within the independent production sector and whether or not those mean that the terms of trade need to be reviewed. And they said that this is a matter that should be kept under review. As a result of that, we decided that we would therefore ask them to conduct a further examination. Now, I think I actually said in my speech, I have a completely open mind on this. So that was a perfectly honest, open statement. I go in with no preconceived view, but obviously, just in the same way as the reason we reviewed the BBC Charter after 10 years, because so much has happened in that intervening 10-year period, equally, as you will be the first to agree, the independent production sector has changed massively since the terms of trade were first introduced. That's not to say they're not still appropriate, but I think it is at least worth just having a look and asking that question and seeking further evidence.
This is the programme producer in me coming out again. We've got a quick final question, and then we're going to have to stop right at the back.
Yeah, hello, it's Steve Hewlett here. First of all, pleased to be of service. Secondly, invoice is in the post. But I'd like to ask you about your review of BBC governance, if I may, just briefly. I understand that executive pay, severance, DMI, £100 million, which is not mentioned, I see, clearly raised very serious governance issues, and we all saw, rather unpleasantly and publicly, the kind of governance system falling apart in front of your committee and Margaret Hodge and others. But when you say that the BBC's made some bad mistakes, and you raise Savile, McAlpine and Ross Brand, surely editorial lapses only really count as a cause for a governance review if they are systematic, deep-seated and so regular as to indicate that. Do I take this to mean that you think that the BBC's editorial lapses in and of themselves would necessitate a governance review?
Well, what I would say is, first of all, I hope I wasn't in breach of copyright, having preached the message about how important it is when I quoted you. But the governance review needs to look at the whole structure and the way in which the BBC is currently governed, and I see that both in terms of the external regulation and the internal management structure. I gave you absolutely right. I could have picked out one or two other examples, and the DMI is a very good example of a failure. But in terms of particular editorial judgments, it's more a question of the compliance regime. As to how those failures took place, and I regard that as part of the overall issue of governance. I don't think it is an aspect which David Clementi will be particularly looking at, but it seems to me it's another example of why the way in which the whole structure of governance is currently conducted at the BBC needs to be examined, and whether, just as an alternative, if you did have a strong unitary board at the top of the BBC, that would have an ability to act as a check on editorial decisions in a way that the Trust can't do because it is currently acting as an arbiter of complaints. So those are the kinds of questions which I think it is only sensible to ask, and which David Clementi will be advising us.
John, this could go on, but we won't get any dinner. So we're going to have to stop there. Can you just join me in thanking John again for coming tonight?